Hoping everyone can see that okay. All right, so everyone, I am here to tackle a subject that is way too big for one presentation. This is just about making your website content better. I'm going to give you some foundations and hopefully a useful beginning guide to sort of auditing and evaluating and then improving the web content that you produce. So what do we mean by web content? Before we can move on to any kind of decision tree, we need to define some context. If you're like me, your first thought for that question is the stuff on your website, which is true. It's all of the text, the images, the audio, the video, the animations, even menus, icons, it's all content. It's what visitors to your site encounter as part of their experience, and it's anything that communicates information to the user. If you're listening right now, you are probably, web content's probably almost the entirety of what you've managed on your website. Teams like mine provide a platform and editors like you provide content. With that in mind, how do we make content better? This is the question that's built an entire discipline. So before we can improve content, we need to be prepared to grade it. For both current and future content, we need to evaluate its quality, test it against a goal, and then we need to create, modify, or remove content based on what we find. This is all part of content strategy. Content strategy is the art of bringing the right content to the right person in the right place at the right time and in the right context. That quote might seem like a mouthful at first, but it's important to frame this in what all of our websites are trying to achieve with their content. Your website exists for a purpose. You need it to accomplish a goal, and what might be useful, usable content for one audience at one time might not be the right content for your audience today. And your audience or their needs or expectations can change over time. So refining your content with content strategy is an ongoing process and not something with a defined endpoint. I want to start here so I can also give you the most important advice of this entire presentation before still we get into the decision tree, which is set a measurable goal. None of the rest of what I have to tell you can be done without a measurable goal. Defining the relationship between your content and your website's goals is the only way to improve your content. If you keep coming to these webinars, you're going to hear this repeated often. Since it's so important, here's some examples. Some goals are really easy to spot. They might be measured by student enrollments or might be measured by dollars raised. But I know for a lot of you, the goals are harder to measure. You raise awareness, you teach a process, you supply resources. I've provided some examples on this slide of how you might choose to measure success for those goals, but the point is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for measuring success on your site. And there's no magic bullet for good content strategy. When in doubt, your site's analytics are indispensable for providing potential ways to measure success. And here, to give a personal example, I'm providing tutorials for users on the platform we have in development. My goal is just to provide a way for users to find answers to questions efficiently, hopefully without needing to send me an email every time they have one. How do I measure that, though? My measurable goal might actually just be to reduce the number of questions coming in about a specific topic. That measurable goal is how I can define the success, even if it might not be the most precise measurement of how helpful the tutorials are. There's always something you can measure. One other important preliminary step is to identify your audience. The more detail you have about your audience, the better. There's a lot to be said about this topic by itself that I'm not going to try to cover here, but you can't deliver the right message if you don't have a good handle on who your content is speaking to. Even if you don't have the resources for in-depth research, try to identify a general idea of something like age range, education level, or background that you can consider when designing content. Finally, the guide. I do want to mention that this decision tree is sort of a work in progress. It's based on my personal experience guiding content editors and my own research with content strategy. It's not a proven authoritative research, but it is something I think you can find some use in. And as always, there will be exceptions depending on your unique circumstances. But with that, we're here. You have a goal, you have an audience, you have a website. If you're not starting from scratch, you also have content. So let's consider a tool to evaluate that content you're making or that you've already made. We're going to evaluate content in two key dimensions. Is it useful and is it usable? We'll start with useful. Most likely, you're going to be considering the value of a specific page within your site. That's the most recognizable unit of content for all of us, so I'll mostly focus on that here. But many of these aspects apply to smaller elements like images, icons, navigation, and anything else you can think of. This is for new and existing content. Maybe you're considering adding content to your site. Maybe it's been on your site since launch. These considerations apply in both cases. Does your audience need or want this content? Right off the bat, we ask the biggest question of the whole tree. Does your audience have a demonstrated need or want for this content? Answering the question properly requires research. It requires supporting evidence, and should be reconsidered frequently. Gather evidence with as much objective value as possible and try not to fall back on personal experiences or assuming that one example is representative of your wider audience. Most of us don't have the budget to carry out detailed market research, but you can always learn a little bit more from your audience. If you're evaluating an existing piece of content on your site, don't hesitate to use your website analytics. I won't rehash my entire last webinar here, but it contains a lot of useful information. If the content's available, but it's not usually accessed, that might be a hint that your audience doesn't want the content, but sometimes there's other factors, and sometimes that happens even when other factors seem to support keeping it around. This will never be an easy question to answer, but if there's not a compelling case for your content's value to your audience, don't have it on your website. Don't let it distract from content that is useful to your audience. Your website is not a filing cabinet, and you want a curated user experience. If there's clear value to your intended audience, then continue on. Does this content already exist? Now it's time to audit your content against the rest of the content you've made available. Duplicate content presents a real problem. The most obvious situation with duplicate content is that one of the content might go out of date while the other content stays relevant. Think of two places on your site talking about a product, and one of them features an outdated price. That could be a serious issue. Avoid this by not serving and maintaining duplicate content. Now, this applies most to entire pages, whereas reproducing an image on multiple pages might not create a serious problem, though it might be a little visually stale. But the idea here is to be efficient with information. Anytime your audience spends parsing through duplicate content is time they could have spent moving a little closer to the goals you set out. Closely related to this is this content up to date? And will it become outdated, or will it stay up to date? This goes hand in hand with identifying duplicate content. Outdated content in some cases can be worse than content that isn't there. Outdated content gives your audience an incorrect information and can undermine their trust in your website's other content. If you're creating content that might become outdated in the future, now is the time to set up a reminder on your calendar to come back to this information at a necessary date. In general, the main lesson here is that all websites need to regularly review their content and keep it up to date. What this means for your website will depend on the frequency that you need to audit it, but I consider a yearly review of your content to be the bare minimum. If the amount of content on your site is something that's making it feel impossible to keep up with, you might want to go back and start over at step one and be a little more aggressive about removing content that doesn't seem to have value. At the end of the day, content on your website, At the end of the day, content on your website is only useful if you or your team is capable of maintaining it. So the next question was, does this content help achieve the goal you set? Your content is valuable, it's unique, and it's up to date if you've made it this far. But if it's not playing a part in increasing enrollments, raising money, driving mailing list subscriptions, whatever of the other possible goals you've set, then there's a problem. Unlike the first parts of this tree, if the answer to this question is no, the first stop should be to revise and refine the content and not get rid of it. Some of the sites we manage have extremely popular pages with tons of traffic, but the visitors enter there, read the content, and leave. It's not always bad, but content like this might need a call to action to see more similar content or to donate, or you get the idea. Guide the audience toward your goal. That said, content that fails this section might still be considered for removal. As a hypothetical example, if you had a page on your site that provided no content except for an image gallery of your photos, that might be interesting to your audience, but it might not help approach that goal. So you maybe should take that page and distribute that content throughout your site. This way it's still providing that interest to your audience, but can be used a little more usefully towards whatever goal you've set. If you've said yes to all four of these questions when you're reviewing a piece of content, your content's probably useful. The next question is this content usable? Usable content is defined by the ability of your users to find your content, to access it, to process it. There are really nuanced issues at play when it comes to content usability. There's psychology, there's artistry, there's culture, readability, disability accommodation, but even small improvements add up to meaningful, measurable results. So don't feel like you need to master every discipline in one go to deliver a great website. Content that is useful but not usable generally needs to be fixed rather than removed. But sometimes that will require changes to other sites of this parts of the site to create a unified, intuitive user experience. So the first part of, is this content usable? Is this content appropriately findable and navigable? This question is really considering how the content you're reviewing exists in relationship to the rest of your site. Can a user who wants this content arriving at your site find it on their own? And remember, not everyone starts at your homepage. Running tests with real users is a really great way to do this. It's probably as good as it gets. I know that it's not always easy to do. Analytics is a little easier, but it sometimes can be difficult to find the difference between a page users don't need and a page users can't find. If you feel that the answer to this question is no, you've really started a whole new process, which is modeling user behavior within a site and how you expect them to travel page to page. And if you've got analytics, you should be able to see some information about how they're traveling from page to page. Sometimes making content easier to find is a matter of adding it to the menu or homepage, but sometimes that issue compounds the problem. I find that most websites have too many options on their menus, too many selections on their homepage. Making content findable is often a side effect of streamlining and simplifying your overall navigation. Fewer items on the homepage, fewer items in the main menu, and generally presenting a clear intended path for your users by highlighting the most valuable content. Is the content accessible? This will be quick because hopefully most of you have attended Cindy Wiley's presentations. I highly recommend those. She is the authority on accessibility for web content. So this slide will be quick. As content editors, especially within the platforms curated by our teams, the most obvious things you can do to help ensure accessibility within a piece of content is provide useful alt text for images, describing the content for users who can't see the image, and also maintaining a sensible hierarchy for your headings, such as heading 2s below heading 1s, heading 3s below heading 2s, that kind of thing. The other thing to be watchful for is PDF content. Creating accessible PDFs is not trivial. It has to be done deliberately. So when possible, it's better to reproduce content directly on a page than provide it in a PDF. Is this content readable? This will be even quicker, as I want to give Christy a chance to talk about this one more in depth. Readability is important, and making sure that your average user can process the content is essential. Consult Christy's presentation for more information on this. Is this content engaging? So I can admit this is a little bit of a blurry line, but it's a question you need to ask about your content. So far, if you've made it here, your content is useful, unique, goal-oriented, findable, accessible, and it's easy to read. But is it engaging? I can accomplish pretty much all of the previous steps with a flat HTML skeleton, black text on a white background, no images. But that's probably not very good content. You wouldn't want to spend much time on that site. You want people to be interested and engaged with your content. Some of this is the job of our team of developers. We provide appropriate menu styling, appropriate fonts, sensible spacing and layouts, but there's still a lot you can do. Anne's presentation will go a little bit more into choosing good images. I recommend leaning on brand guidelines to create unity with that content. Streamline your menus, like I mentioned before, but there's no magic bullet here. This could be an entire discipline unto itself of making engaging, interesting content. So I leave this final step to you. Engaging content is going to be a little bit different for all of you, and it tends to be an interdisciplinary sort of clash of art and science to get the most out of it. So use your data, lean on your best writers and designers, and make your best effort to create engaging content. If you do, and you've made it this far, your content is off to a great start. But this is not a one-time process. Repeat it. This is the consideration that should be given to all your content and should be reviewed on a regular basis. Sometimes we do this whole process, we think something's useful and usable, and our analytics, testing, or our measurable goals end up proving us wrong. That's why the measurable goals are there in the first place, to check your assumptions and give you a reason to go back and try something different until you know you've got it right. That's all for me.